My name is Major Evelyn Grant, and on the day of my grandfather's funeral, I was told that my 12 years of service as a combat engineer were worth exactly 1 ounce of rusted iron, while my cousin Vanessa's lifetime of social climbing had earned her a $2.4 million real estate portfolio. I stood in the foyer of the Greystone Manor in Greenwich, Connecticut, the air thick with the scent of overpriced lilies and the metallic tang of rainy pavement. My Army service uniform felt like a second skin, the fabric crisp from the $12 starch job at the cleaners on 5th Street, but the weight of the ribbons on my chest felt insignificant compared to the sheer venom in Vanessa's voice. She stood there, her hand resting on a mahogany side table worth more than my annual base pay, adjusting her $4,500 Cartier love bracelet with a smirk that suggested she had already mentally spent the inheritance. She looked at the small, corroded object in my palm, a heavy antique skeleton key with a clover-shaped bow, and laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed against the vaulted ceilings. I am 34 years old and I have spent over a decade building bridges and deconstructing explosives in provinces that most people back home couldn't find on a map. Yet in this room, surrounded by family who measured worth in zip codes and equity, I was the failure. The lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne who wore a 3-piece suit that likely cost $3,000 and smelled faintly of expensive cedarwood and espresso, cleared his throat as he handed Vanessa the deed to a commercial complex in downtown Stamford. My grandfather, Silas Grant, had been a man of terrifying silence and immense wealth, a patriarch who ran a logistics empire with the precision of a clockmaker. We all expected the distribution to be lopsided because Vanessa had spent the last 5 years playing the part of the dutiful granddaughter, bringing him organic teas and pretending to care about his stamp collection, while I was stationed at Fort Leonard Wood or deployed to the Middle East. But a rusty key felt like a deliberate insult, a final slap from a man who always valued tangible assets over abstract concepts like service or duty. Vanessa leaned in close, the scent of her $340 Baccarat Rouge 540 perfume cloying and sweet, and whispered that perhaps I could use the key to lock away my pride before I headed back to the barracks. She didn't know that as a combat engineer, I was trained to look at the structural integrity of everything from physical bridges to human character, and I could see the hairline fractures in her confidence even as she gloated. I gripped the key, the rough texture of the rust biting into my skin, and noticed a small serial number engraved near the tip, April 12, 88. It wasn't just a random piece of junk. I felt the cool draft from the manor's air conditioning, set to a precise 68 degrees, and looked at the grandfather clock in the hallway, its heavy pendulum swinging with a rhythmic thud that sounded like a heartbeat. My mind began to race, calculating the possibilities as I ignored the muffled conversations of grieving relatives who were already calculating their own cuts. I remembered Silas telling me once when I was just a cadet at West Point, that the most valuable things in life are often hidden behind the things people are too arrogant to notice. Vanessa was busy scrolling through her phone, likely checking the current market value of the property at 412 Atlantic Street, completely unaware that her windfall was tied to a man who never gave anything away for free. I walked out of the manor, the gravel of the driveway crunching under my polished black Oxfords, and climbed into my 2022 slate gray Toyota Tacoma. The interior smelled of old coffee and CLP gun oil, a stark contrast to the opulence I had just left. I placed the key in the cup holder and stared at it. This wasn't just a memento of a disappointing inheritance. It was a tool. My grandfather knew I knew how to build, but more importantly, he knew I knew how to take things apart. As I turned the ignition and heard the 3.5-liter V6 engine roar to life, I realized that the real estate portfolio wasn't the prize, and the rusty key wasn't the insult. The game had just started, and Vanessa had no idea that I was already 3 steps ahead of her, looking for the lock that this $2.4 million distraction was meant to hide. Family isn't always about who shares your blood. Sometimes, it's about who has the tactical patience to wait for the truth to emerge from the shadows of a legacy built on secrets. Growing up in the humid, rapidly expanding suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, the Grant name carried a weight that felt like iron on my shoulders, a reputation forged in red clay and diesel fumes. My grandfather, Samuel Grant, was a legend in Mecklenburg County who had built Grant and Mason construction from the ground up, starting with nothing but a single, battered 1968 Caterpillar D6 bulldozer and a $500 loan he had to beg for from a local credit union. He was a man of calloused hands and precise ledgers, yet as I stood in the foyer of his estate clutching that rusted key, I realized how much the family tree had rotted from the inside out. While I was pulling 16-hour shifts in the mud at Fort Leonard Wood and later in the grueling heat of overseas deployments, meticulously saving exactly $42,650 over 3 years to wipe out my student loans, my cousin Vanessa had turned being a parasite into a high-stakes profession. She didn't understand the value of a dollar earned through sweat. She only understood the value of a dollar extracted through manipulation. She lived a life of curated perfection in a $3,200 a month luxury condo in uptown Charlotte, overlooking the skyline from floor-to-ceiling windows that I likely could have appraised for structural wind resistance in my sleep. She moved through the world in a pristine white 2023 Porsche Macan S, a vehicle that cost more than my entire 4-year housing allowance, and she draped herself in designer labels like Celine and Saint Laurent that made my crisp Army service uniform look like a bargain bin find. Every single cent of her existence was subsidized by loans from Grandpa Samuel, debts that were never recorded on paper and certainly never intended to be repaid. I remember coming home on leave and seeing her sip a $24 craft cocktail at a rooftop bar while I sat there with dirt still under my fingernails from a bridge demolition exercise, listening to her complain about the stress of choosing a marble finish for her new kitchen island. The contrast was a jagged pill to swallow. I was the one following in Samuel's footsteps of service and hard labor, yet I was treated like the black sheep for choosing the military over the family boardroom. Vanessa's smirk as she toyed with her jewelry wasn't just about the money. It was a victory lap over the fact that she had successfully convinced the patriarch that my absence was a sign of abandonment rather than duty. She had spent years whispering in his ear during Sunday dinners at the Capitol Grill, ordering the $120 dry-aged ribeye on his tab while I was eating lukewarm emeries in a tent. She played the part of the devoted granddaughter to perfection, making sure to be photographed at every charity gala in the Queen City, always ensuring Samuel was the center of attention while I was just a grainy face on a FaceTime call from a different time zone. As I looked at the $2.4 million real estate portfolio the lawyer had just slid into her manicured hands, I could see the line items for properties I used to play in as a child. Warehouses on South Tryon and office buildings near Dilworth, now belonging to a woman who couldn't tell the difference between a load-bearing wall and a curtain rod. But as my fingers traced the jagged teeth of the rusty key, I felt a familiar tactical calm wash over me. Samuel Grant was a master of foundations, and you don't build a construction empire without knowing exactly where to hide the most important assets. Vanessa had the deed to the house, but as a combat engineer, I knew that the real power always lies in the blueprints and the hidden vaults that people like her are too shallow to ever find. This wasn't a loss, it was a reconnaissance mission, and I was just beginning to map out the terrain of my grandfather's true intentions. The funeral service at St. Jude's Cathedral was nothing short of a meticulously choreographed performance where the grief was as synthetic as the floral arrangements lining the altar. Vanessa had arrived in a custom-tailored black silk dress paired with a $2,000 French lace veil that she adjusted incessantly to ensure the local photographer from the Charlotte Observer captured her supposed heartbreak for the society pages. I watched from the second pew, my back straight in my Army service uniform, feeling the stifling heat of the cathedral's incense mixing with the heavy scent of lilies that cost more than a month's rent in a decent neighborhood. To the outside world, she was the grieving heiress, the porcelain doll of the Grant dynasty crumbling under the weight of loss. But I saw the way her eyes darted toward the mahogany casket, calculating the inheritance before the first handful of North Carolina clay even touched the lid. My grandfather Samuel deserved better than a spectacle, but as a major in the Army Corps of Engineers, I knew that some structures are built on hollow ground, and our family dynamic was a textbook case of structural failure hidden behind a polished facade. Once the charade at the cemetery was concluded, the atmosphere shifted from performative mourning to cold, calculated greed as we transitioned to the offices of Sterling and Associates. Located in a glass and steel high-rise overlooking the bustling traffic of Tryon Street, the office was a sanctuary of old money, with walls paneled in deep African mahogany and floors covered in Persian rugs that muffled every footstep. We entered the conference room at exactly 11:14 a.m., the digital clock on the wall blinking with a precision that mirrored my own internal tactical clock. The air inside the room was stagnant, smelling of expensive Italian leather chairs and the bitter, burnt aroma of stale espresso from a machine that probably cost $5,000. Vanessa sat across from me, crossing her legs and smoothing her dress with a sense of entitlement that radiated off her like heat from a desert tarmac. She didn't look at the framed photos of Samuel's first construction projects on the walls. She looked only at the thick, cream-colored manila folder resting on the center of the polished table. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the same mahogany as his desk, his silver hair slicked back and his cufflinks glinting under the recessed LED lighting. He opened the folder with a deliberate, agonizing slowness that sent the tension in the room skyrocketing until it was a physical weight pressing against my chest. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of a gold-rimmed wall clock, each second sounding like a countdown to an explosion I had been trained to defuse but was now forced to witness. I kept my hands folded on the table, my grip steady, while Vanessa tapped her manicured nails against her iPhone 15 Pro, her eyes hungrily scanning the documents before Sterling even began to speak. I could see the reflection of the legal headers in her designer sunglasses perched atop her head, and I realized that to her, this wasn't about a grandfather's legacy or the blood and sweat Samuel had poured into Grant and Mason construction. This was a payday, a final clearing of the debts she had accrued while playing the role of the favorite child. As Sterling cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles, I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline I usually reserved for the blast zone, knowing that whatever was inside that folder would either solidify the injustice of the last decade or reveal the hidden blueprints of a man who always kept his true plans locked behind a rusted door. The atmosphere in the conference room of Sterling and Associates shifted from tense anticipation to a cold, calculated massacre of my expectations as the reading of the will commenced with the precision of a firing squad. Mr. Sterling adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles and began reciting the distribution of an empire that had taken 50 years to build, starting with the crown jewels of the Grant legacy. Vanessa was awarded the $1.8 million lake house on Lake Norman, a sprawling 6-bedroom estate with a private pier and a custom-built boathouse, along with a staggering 40% of the voting shares in Grant and Mason construction. My brother Dylan, who had spent most of his 20s drifting through expensive European hostels on our grandfather's dime, was granted a $250,000 investment account managed by a top-tier firm in New York City. The room was silent, save for the scratching of a fountain pen and the distant hum of the HVAC system, until the lawyer reached the final addendum of the document. He paused, looking at me with an expression that hovered somewhere between pity and professional detachment, and read the words Samuel had written specifically for his eldest granddaughter. To my granddaughter Evelyn, who understands duty without the need for applause or audience, I leave the brass key located in the velvet-lined tray of my top mahogany desk drawer at the family estate. Mr. Sterling reached into a small velvet pouch and placed a tarnished, heavy brass key on the polished surface of the table, its surface covered in a greenish patina and smelling faintly of old copper and basement dust. The silence that followed was broken by a sharp, jagged burst of laughter from Vanessa that sliced through the professional decorum of the office like a blade. She laughed so violently that she jolted her hand, spilling half of her $12 glass of oaky Chardonnay onto the edge of the antique Persian rug, the pale liquid soaking into the intricate wool fibers. She didn't even bother to blot the stain, instead pointing a manicured finger at the rusted object sitting in front of me while her eyes danced with a cruel, triumphant light. She sneered that all my years of playing the hero and wearing a dusty uniform had finally paid off with a piece of scrap metal that looked like it belonged in a junkyard on the outskirts of Gastonia. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but I kept my posture rigid, my training as a major in the Army Corps of Engineers forcing me to maintain a mask of stoic indifference while my heart hammered against my ribs. The rest of the family members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, looking away from me and staring at the floor or the framed architectural drawings on the walls to avoid acknowledging the blatant insult. I could see the pity in my aunt's eyes, the kind of look one gives a wounded animal, as they all internally labeled me the poor soldier who had been forgotten by the patriarch in favor of the glamorous socialite. To them, the key was a symbol of Samuel's senility or a final, cryptic punishment for my choice to serve my country instead of the family business. Vanessa continued to gloat, leaning back in her chair and checking the time on her watch as if the rest of the meeting was a waste of her now very expensive time. But as I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold, heavy metal of the key, I didn't feel the weight of a failure or the sting of a disappointment. I felt the specific density of high-grade brass and noticed the unique, hand-filed grooves on the bit that suggested this wasn't a mass-produced item from a hardware store. While Vanessa saw a piece of junk and the family saw a tragedy, I saw a technical challenge that required a different kind of reconnaissance. Samuel Grant was a man who measured twice and cut once, and he never left a bridge to nowhere without a very specific reason for the destination. I stood up, tucked the key into the pocket of my uniform, and walked out of the room without saying a word, leaving the sound of Vanessa's fading laughter behind me as I stepped into the elevator to begin the search for the lock that this brass secret was destined to open. That night, the silence of Charlotte felt heavier than the humid air of a humid July evening as I sat in the driver's seat of my 2018 granite crystal metallic Jeep Wrangler, parked in the furthest corner of a dimly lit Denny's lot at 2:45 a.m. The neon yellow sign of the diner flickered with a rhythmic hum that matched the pulsing of the adrenaline still coursing through my veins after the humiliation at the law office. I held the heavy brass key in my right hand, feeling its substantial weight and the way the edges had been worn smooth by years of contact with skin, smelling of aged metal and the faint salty tang of my own sweat. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a standard yellow legal pad and a matte black tactical pen, the kind I had used to sign off on demolition manifests and structural reports for years. With a steady hand, I drew a single uncompromising vertical line down the center of the first page, creating a ledger of my current standing in the world I had once called home. On the left side, under the heading of family support, I wrote a cold and hollow $0, acknowledging that the people who shared my DNA had written me off as a charitable footnote in their pursuit of Samuel's millions. On the right side, under the heading of integrity, I wrote 100%, a figure that no amount of Vanessa's inherited real estate or Dylan's investment dividends could ever dilute or diminish. Grandpa Samuel was a man governed by the laws of physics and the uncompromising reality of blueprints. He didn't do accidents, and he certainly didn't do sentimental junk without a functional purpose. He was a master of logistics who could calculate the load-bearing capacity of a steel girder in his head, and he would never have survived 50 years in the cutthroat North Carolina construction industry by making sloppy errors in his final testament. I stared at the key under the dim glow of the Jeep's dome light, realizing that this wasn't a snub or a sign of senility, but a direct mission handed from one engineer to another. It was a tactical deployment, a hidden objective that required the specific set of skills I had honed while building infrastructure under fire and navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Department of Defense. Vanessa and the rest of the family were currently celebrating their windfalls with overpriced champagne and dreams of easy equity, but they failed to realize that they were standing on a foundation I was uniquely qualified to inspect. If they wanted a war over the scraps of a legacy they hadn't lifted a finger to build, then I would give them a masterclass in strategy that would make their corporate maneuvering look like child's play. I thought about the 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe Vanessa was likely already eyeing to replace her Porsche, and the way she had looked at me with such profound pity, never imagining that the poor soldier was already conducting a site survey of her downfall. My mind began to sift through the archives of my memory, looking for the specific lock that matched the unique hand-filed bit of the brass key, calculating the locations of Samuel's oldest properties and the private storage units he had maintained since the 1980s. The engine of the Jeep ticked as it cooled down, a metallic staccato that sounded like the cocking of a weapon, and I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me that I hadn't felt since my last rotation in the field. I wasn't just a granddaughter with a piece of rusted metal. I was a major in the United States Army with a clear objective and the technical expertise to dismantle any empire built on lies and unearned arrogance. I put the Jeep into gear, the 3.6-liter Pentastar engine purring with a low, predatory growl as I pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the old Grant and Mason warehouse district where the real history of our family remained buried in the concrete. I didn't drive toward the shimmering lights of the Lake Norman estate or the hollow congratulations of my relatives. Instead, I steered my Jeep toward the outskirts of Gastonia, where the original Grant and Mason farmhouse sat like a silent sentinel over a forgotten gravel lot. The structure was a weathered relic of 1940s architecture, its white paint peeling in long strips like sunburnt skin, and the air inside smelled of 50 years of accumulated dust, 10W30 motor oil, and the sweet, heavy scent of cured tobacco. I wasn't going in alone because tactical success requires specialized intelligence. So I hired Sarah Jenkins, a forensic auditor who charged a premium $350 an hour and had a reputation in North Carolina for finding buried gold in the most convoluted of corporate shells. We spent 72 grueling hours in that cramped back office, illuminated only by a pair of flickering fluorescent tubes and the blue light of Sarah's high-end Lenovo ThinkPad P1 workstation. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of old paper, and every time we moved a stack of invoices, a cloud of fine gray dust settled over our clothes. But we didn't stop because I knew the brass key in my pocket was the final piece of a structural puzzle that Samuel had left specifically for me to solve. I approached the massive heavy oak desk that had served as my grandfather's command center for over half a century, its surface scarred by the marks of heavy blueprints and thousands of cups of black coffee. I knelt on the creaking floorboards and inserted the tarnished brass key into the lock of the deep bottom drawer, feeling the internal tumblers click into place with a satisfying mechanical snap that echoed through the silent farmhouse. I expected to find a hidden stash of cash or perhaps a forgotten deed, but as the drawer slid open on its iron rollers, I found something far more dangerous to the family empire. A thick leather-bound ledger with Samuel's unmistakable, cramped handwriting. This wasn't just a record of construction costs. It was a secret, meticulously detailed log of every single cent that Vanessa and my Uncle Robert had siphoned from the company under the guise of operating expenses and emergency loans over the last 15 years. As Sarah began scanning the pages into her software, her eyes widened at the sheer scale of the embezzlement, noting a sequence of wire transfers totaling over $400,000 that had been masked as equipment maintenance but actually funded Vanessa's 2023 Porsche and her designer wardrobe. The ledger was a roadmap of betrayal, documenting how Uncle Robert had inflated the costs of raw materials by 30% and kicked back the difference into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands while I was dodging IEDs in a combat zone. Each entry was dated and cross-referenced with internal invoice numbers, showing a systematic dismantling of the company's liquidity that would leave Grant and Mason Construction bankrupt within 24 months if left unchecked. I sat there in the dim light, the cool metal of the brass key still in my palm, and realized that my grandfather hadn't given me a gift. He had given me a weapon and a set of coordinates. He knew that if he left me the company shares outright, the legal battles with the favored heirs would last for decades, so he gave me the evidence to burn the whole house down instead. Vanessa was currently sleeping in her $1.8 million lake house, dreaming of her new social status, while I was holding the literal receipts for her lifestyle that would likely lead to a federal indictment. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon in a haze of North Carolina orange and purple, I looked at Sarah and told her to double-check the figures on the 2021 asphalt contract because I wanted the forensic report to be as structurally sound as a reinforced concrete bridge. My family thought I had been discarded like a piece of junk, but they were about to learn that in the world of engineering, the smallest components are often the ones that hold the entire bridge together or in this case ensure its spectacular and public collapse. The numbers reflected in those yellowed ledger pages were more than just figures. They were a systematic dismantling of a 50-year legacy, totaling a staggering $1,142,000 in unauthorized consulting fees diverted over the last 48 months alone. Sarah Jenkins sat beside me in the dim light of the farmhouse, her fingers flying across her mechanical keyboard as she cross-referenced the handwritten entries with the digital shadows left behind in the company's Chase business banking portal. We discovered a $340,000 withdrawal flagged as a marketing trip to St. Bart's, which upon further inspection of the stapled social media printouts Grandpa had saved, was actually the receipt for Vanessa's 30th birthday bash at a private villa overlooking Eden Rock. There were even smaller, more insulting thefts, like the $85,000 earmarked for office renovations at the main headquarters that had somehow paid for custom Italian marble countertops and a sub-zero refrigerator in Vanessa's uptown condo. Every single cent was documented with my grandfather Samuel's meticulous, sharp handwriting, his notes in the margins pointing out the exact dates when Uncle Robert had forged signatures or when Vanessa had submitted inflated reimbursement forms for her personal shopping sprees at Neiman Marcus. It became chillingly clear that Samuel wasn't a victim of their greed. He was a silent witness who had spent his final years acting as a forensic trapsetter, watching them steal with the cold detachment of a man observing termites in a foundation. He knew they were siphoning the lifeblood out of Grant and Mason Construction, but he also knew that simply cutting them off would lead to a messy public legal battle that would destroy the company before it could be saved. He was waiting for someone with the tactical guts to take this ammunition and fire it with the precision of a marksman, someone who didn't care about the social fallout or the family-first rhetoric that Vanessa used as a shield for her larceny. I felt a surge of cold fury as I looked at a receipt for a $12,000 business dinner that was actually the down payment on the white Porsche Macan S she had bragged about at the funeral. The air in the room felt ionized, like the atmosphere before a massive lightning strike, as I realized that the brass key didn't just open a desk. It opened a cage where the predators had grown fat and complacent on stolen meat. Sarah looked up from her screen, her face pale under the flickering fluorescent light, and told me that the evidence was not just sufficient for a civil suit, but was a textbook case for a federal wire fraud investigation due to the interstate nature of the transfers. My grandfather had even gone as far as to staple the original carbon copies of the checks to the back of the ledger, showing the discrepancies between the official company books and the reality of their spending. He had left me the junk, because he knew that Vanessa's $2 million real estate portfolio was built on a foundation of sand and stolen bricks, and that with one phone call to the district attorney, I could pull the thread that would unravel her entire existence. I leaned back in the creaking wooden chair, the weight of my Army service uniform feeling lighter as I transitioned from a grieving granddaughter to a major executing a final, decisive maneuver. Vanessa thought she had won the war because she had the deed to a lake house, but she had failed to realize that in Samuel Grant's world, you never leave a flank unguarded. I picked up my phone at 4:15 a.m., the screen reflecting in the tarnished brass of the key on the desk, and began drafting the initial report that would turn her $4,500 Cartier love bracelet into a piece of evidence in a criminal conspiracy. The disappointing grandchild was about to become the architect of their absolute and total ruin, and I intended to make the demolition as public and as permanent as a controlled implosion of a faulty skyscraper. The Charlotte night was thick with a humid 82-degree heat that clung to the glass facade of the Marriott Marquis, but inside the grand ballroom, the air conditioning was blasting a clinical 65 degrees to accommodate the egos of the city's elite. This was the annual Founders Gala, a tradition my grandfather Samuel had started to celebrate the blue-collar roots of Grant and Mason construction, but Vanessa had twisted it into a coronation ceremony for her own unearned ascension. She had authorized a $15,000 expenditure from the corporate general fund for a custom-made midnight blue silk gown that shimmered like an oil slick under the Swarovski crystal chandeliers, and she had invited over 150 of the region's most influential developers, bankers and politicians to witness her being named chairwoman. I arrived at the main entrance at exactly 8 p.m., bypassing the valet and parking my Jeep myself, trading my Army service uniform for a sharp, charcoal gray power suit from Theory that cost $800 and made me look less like a soldier and more like a liquidator. I wasn't carrying a weapon, but the black pebble grain leather briefcase in my right hand felt just as heavy, containing 3 sets of notarized affidavits, Sarah Jenkins' final forensic audit, and the original leather-bound ledger that held the death warrant for Vanessa's social standing. The ballroom smelled of expensive gardenias and the metallic tang of chilled champagne, a $12,000 catering bill that I knew for a fact had been charged to the company's emergency maintenance line. Vanessa was standing near the center stage, a glass of vintage Veuve Clicquot in her hand, her $4,500 Cartier love bracelet catching the light as she gestured toward a rendering of a new luxury high-rise she claimed was her first major project. She saw me approaching and her smile didn't just fade. It curdled into a mask of polite condescension as she prepared to dismiss the disappointing cousin who had only inherited a piece of rusted brass. Uncle Robert was beside her, looking bloated in a tuxedo that struggled to contain his midsection, leaning in to whisper a joke that I'm certain was at my expense. They had no idea that the junk Samuel had left me had provided the exact coordinates for the structural collapse of their charade, or that the woman walking toward them was trained in the art of controlled demolitions. I didn't head for the bar or the buffet. I walked straight to the sound booth at the back of the room, where a 20-something technician was preparing the introductory video for Vanessa's big moment. I handed him a thumb drive and a $50 bill, telling him there had been a last-minute change to the presentation approved by the board, and as a major, I had a way of speaking that brooked no argument from civilians. I then moved toward the head table, setting my briefcase down on the white linen cloth with a deliberate thud that drew the attention of the surrounding guests. Vanessa walked over, her silk train hissing against the polished marble floor, and asked in a sharp whisper what on earth I thought I was doing showing up to her night looking like a mid-level accountant. I looked her directly in the eyes, noticing the slight tremor in her hand that suggested her confidence was as thin as the silk she was wearing, and I told her that I was simply here to fulfill the final clause of our grandfather's legacy. The lights in the ballroom began to dim for the keynote presentation, and I felt a cold, tactical satisfaction settle in my chest as the first slide appeared on the massive twin projectors, not showing Vanessa's portrait, but a high-resolution scan of page 42 of the secret ledger detailing her $1 million theft. The war she wanted had finally arrived, and I was about to show the entire city of Charlotte exactly what happens when you try to build a life on a foundation of stolen gravel and lies. As Vanessa stood on the elevated mahogany podium, her fingers trembling slightly around the stem of a crystal flute filled with $200 Veuve Clicquot, I stepped out from the shadows of the sound booth and moved toward the secondary microphone at the edge of the stage. The grand ballroom of the Marriott Marquis, which only moments ago had been a cacophony of elite chatter and the clinking of silverware, fell into a vacuum of silence so absolute that the sound of a single silver fork hitting a Royal Doulton china plate in the third row echoed like a gunshot. I adjusted the mic stand with the practiced, efficient movements of a commanding officer, my charcoal gray theory suit cutting a sharp, lethal silhouette against the vibrant midnight blue of Vanessa's $15,000 silk gown. I didn't need to scream to command the room. I simply leaned in and told the gathered crowd of Charlotte's most powerful figures that my grandfather Samuel had left me a single brass key that opened a door none of them were ever intended to see. Vanessa's face went from a pale ivory to a sickly mottled gray as I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the first notarized affidavit, my voice remaining as steady as a structural beam while I began to read the dates and the exact dollar amounts of her betrayal. I started with the smaller thefts to build the tension, reciting the $12,400 charge for a Cartier love bracelet on June 14 and the $4,000 monthly lease payment for a white 2023 Porsche Macan S on August 1, all while the massive twin projectors behind me displayed the high-resolution scans of the ledger entries in Samuel's own handwriting. The true horror in the room didn't peak, however, until I revealed that these luxury spoils hadn't just been siphoned from the company's general operating budget, but had been meticulously billed to the Grant and Mason Employee Pension Fund, the very money meant to support the retired laborers who had spent 30 years in the North Carolina heat. I watched the eyes of the city's elite shift from curiosity to profound disgust as they realized they were witnessing a public execution of a social reputation, with each line item acting as a fresh nail in the coffin of Vanessa's career. Uncle Robert attempted to move toward the stage, his face flushed a deep, panicked crimson that clashed with his black tuxedo, but I simply turned the page and began reading the offshore wire transfer codes he had used to hide $300,000 in a Cayman Islands shell company. The air in the ballroom felt heavy and charged with the ozone of a coming storm, the 65-degree air conditioning doing nothing to cool the rising heat of the scandal unfolding on the stage. I looked directly at Vanessa, whose glass of champagne was now tilted at a dangerous angle, her hand shaking so violently that the golden liquid threatened to stain her custom silk dress. I didn't feel pity for her, only a cold sense of tactical accomplishment as I realized that the disappointing grandchild had successfully dismantled a criminal empire using nothing but a rusted piece of metal and the truth. Every guest in the room, from the bank presidents to the city council members, was now staring at the screen in morbid fascination, checking their own phones as the local news reporters in the back of the room began typing furiously. I continued to read, my voice a rhythmic staccato of justice, detailing the $85,000 kitchen renovation and the $340,000 Street Bart's birthday trip, ensuring that by the time I finished, there wouldn't be a single person in the Queen City who would even take a phone call from a Grant again. This wasn't just a reading of a ledger. It was a masterclass in the demolition of a legacy built on sand. And as I reached the final page, I knew that the brass key had finally served its purpose of unlocking the cage where the truth had been kept prisoner for far too long. The atmosphere in the Marriott Marquis Grand Ballroom shifted from a celebratory gala to a clinical public execution as I stepped down from the dais and began hand-delivering the thermal-bound folders of the forensic audit to the 5 members of the board of directors sitting at the front table. The heavy high-grade bond paper of the affidavits crinkled in the sudden deafening silence of the room, each folder containing clear high-resolution scans of the bank transfers that Samuel had so meticulously recorded in his final years of life. Vanessa's face transitioned from a frantic, panicked ivory to a sickly, mottled gray that made her $15,000 custom silk gown look like a funeral shroud as she realized the depth of the tactical trap I had laid for her. Her fingers were trembling so violently that the stem of her $200 glass of Veuve Clicquot finally snapped or slipped, and the crystal shattered against the polished marble floor with a sharp, dissonant ring that punctuated the list of her crimes. The golden liquid splattered across her designer heels, but she didn't even flinch, her eyes locked onto the massive projection screen that now displayed a wire transfer for $85,000 used to install a custom Italian marble kitchen in her uptown condo. Uncle Robert made a clumsy, desperate attempt to stand up, his face a dark, dangerous shade of crimson as he prepared to shout a denial, but his own wife, my Aunt Margaret, reached up and grabbed his sleeve with a force that nearly pulled him off balance. She yanked him back down into his leather-padded chair, her expression a mask of profound disgust and cold realization as she looked at the evidence of the secret Cayman Islands accounts he had been hiding even from her. The power dynamic in the room had inverted in less than 10 minutes, and the woman who had spent the last decade being the golden child, the favorite who was showered with unearned luxury and praise, was being systematically dismantled by the very person she had called disappointing just 72 hours earlier in the lawyer's office. I stood in the center of the room in my charcoal gray theory suit, my posture rigid and my expression as unreadable as a tactical map, watching as the board of directors began flipping through the pages with frantic, trembling hands. They weren't just looking at a family squabble. They were looking at a $1.1 million hole in the company's infrastructure that could lead to federal racketeering charges and the total collapse of the Grant and Mason brand. The scent of spilled champagne and expensive perfume was now replaced by the metallic tang of fear as Vanessa tried to find her voice, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out to defend the indefensible. I didn't feel the rush of petty vengeance that a civilian might feel. Instead, I felt the quiet, grim satisfaction of an engineer who had successfully identified a structural flaw and applied the exact amount of pressure required to bring the faulty building down. I watched as the chairman of the board, a man who had known my grandfather for 40 years, looked up from the ledger and signaled to the 2 security guards standing by the mahogany doors. There was no more laughter, no more pity for the poor soldier in the dusty uniform, and no more social climbing for the woman who had built her throne on the backs of the company's pension holders. The execution was clinical, precise, and absolute, leaving Vanessa standing in a pool of shattered glass and ruined silk, while I remained the only one in the room whose foundation was still built on solid, uncompromising ground. My grandfather had given me a rusted brass key because he knew that while money can buy a Porsche or a Cartier bracelet, it can never buy the kind of integrity required to burn a legacy to the ground in order to save its soul. The aftermath of the Founders' Gala was not a slow decline but a total and violent collapse of the fraudulent empire Vanessa and Uncle Robert had spent 15 years constructing from stolen bricks and unearned arrogance. Within 48 hours of my presentation at the Marriott Marquis, the board of directors convened an emergency session in the mahogany-paneled boardroom and voted unanimously to terminate both of them for cause, a move designed to insulate Grant and Mason Construction from a massive multi-million-dollar racketeering lawsuit. The legal machinery my grandfather Samuel had lubricated with his secret ledger ground into motion with terrifying efficiency, resulting in a court-ordered clawback that targeted every single asset siphoned from the employee pension fund. The $1.1 million in unauthorized consulting fees and marketing expenses were systematically recovered through the liquidation of Vanessa's luxury holdings, stripping her of the gilded life she had bought with other people's retirement security. The white 2023 Porsche Macan S was repossessed from her driveway in a very public display for the neighbors to witness, and the $3,200 a month uptown condo with its custom Italian marble kitchen was put on the market to satisfy the company's restitution demands. Vanessa's fall from the heights of Charlotte's social registry was absolute, her name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in the very country clubs where she once held court in her designer silk gowns. She no longer spends her mornings choosing between Saint Laurent accessories or planning 5-figure birthday trips to St. Bart's. Instead, she is now seen navigating the congested traffic of Independence Boulevard in a 12-year-old silver Honda Civic with a significant dent in the passenger side fender and a persistent engine rattle. Her current reality consists of standing on her feet for 8-hour shifts at a mid-tier department store at South Park Mall, earning exactly $16.50 an hour plus a meager commission on housewares. The Cartier love bracelet that she once used as a weapon of condescension was sold at an estate auction to help cover her legal fees, leaving her wrists bare and her ego shattered in the face of a world that no longer recognizes her as anything more than a disgraced clerk. Uncle Robert fared no better, facing a federal investigation into his offshore accounts that has frozen his remaining assets and left him living in a cramped two-bedroom rental in a part of Gastonia he used to mock from the window of his Mercedes. My brother Dylan, finally realizing that he had aligned himself with the losing side of a tactical war, has vanished into a self-imposed exile of shame, having not called or texted me in over 6 months since the truth was revealed. He was never the architect of the theft, but his silence during my years of service and his willingness to accept the $250,000 investment account without questioning its source made him a silent partner in the family's moral decay. I still have the brass key, though its purpose has been fulfilled, and it now sits on the mantle of my own modest home, a reminder that the strongest structures are not built with money but with the uncompromising integrity of an engineer's soul. I am still Major Evelyn Grant, and I still wake up at 0500 to the sound of a world that requires building and protecting, knowing that my grandfather's junk was the only inheritance that actually mattered in the end. Family isn't about the blood that flows through your veins or the deeds to lake houses that can be taken away by a judge's gavel. Family is the silent pact of duty and the courage to burn down a lie to ensure the foundation remains pure. As I look out over the North Carolina skyline, I realize that the disappointing grandchild didn't just win a war. She restored the integrity of a name that was almost lost to the greed of those who never understood the weight of a single rusted piece of brass. I took my legitimate portion of the inheritance, the redirected funds that the courts stripped from Vanessa and Uncle Robert's frozen accounts, and used it to establish the Samuel Grant Veteran Foundation with an initial endowment of $500,000 specifically designed to help returning soldiers transition into civilian trades like masonry and structural engineering. The foundation operates out of a renovated brick warehouse on the edge of the Dilworth neighborhood, a space that smells of fresh sawdust and possibility rather than the stale greed of a corporate boardroom. I chose to step away from the chaotic center of Charlotte's high society drama, moving instead into a quiet 1,200-square-foot craftsman-style home in a wooded area where the only sounds are the evening cicadas and the distant hum of the interstate. My house has a wide wraparound porch made of pressure-treated southern yellow pine that faces the western horizon, and every evening at approximately 6:42 p.m., I sit there in a weathered Adirondack chair and watch the sun bleed into the North Carolina treeline. I am Major Evelyn Grant, and in the silence of those sunsets, I finally processed the depth of the final lesson my grandfather Samuel intended to teach me through a rusted piece of brass metal. He knew that the absolute power of a legacy does not reside in the square footage of a lake house or the prestige of a luxury SUV, but rather in the cold, hard reality of what you can prove when the lights are bright and the auditors are in the room. By leaving me that key, he wasn't testing my patience. He was validating my tactical training and my fundamental sense of justice, knowing I was the only member of the Grant bloodline who wouldn't be blinded by the glitter of stolen gold. Vanessa's social media accounts have long since gone dark, the curated images of her Saint Laurent bags replaced by the harsh reality of a retail clock-in system, and I have found a profound, structural peace in the absence of her toxic influence. Cutting off my biological family was a necessary demolition of a faulty support beam that was threatening to bring down my entire internal architecture, a strategic withdrawal that saved my sanity and allowed me to build something that actually helps people. The Samuel Grant Veteran Foundation has already helped its first cohort of 12 veterans earn their certifications in heavy equipment operation, using the same type of Caterpillar machinery that Samuel used to build his first driveway back in 1968. I keep the original brass key in a small shadow box on my mantle next to my meritorious service medal, not as a trophy of a victory over my cousins, but as a symbol of the precision required to maintain one's integrity in a world built on shortcuts. My life is now defined by the quality of the bridges I build for others rather than the walls I had to tear down to find the truth, and I have learned that a small 1,200-square-foot home with a solid foundation is worth infinitely more than a $2 million estate built on a sinkhole of lies. I finally understand that Samuel didn't just leave me a key to a desk. He left me the key to my own liberation from a family history that was destined to fail. The air on my porch is clean, my conscience is clear, and for the first time in 34 years, I am standing on ground that I know for a fact is structurally sound and entirely my own.